The morning my son called to demand an $870,000 mansion, I was standing in my kitchen in a faded bathrobe, burning toast and arguing with my coffee maker. It was the most ordinary Tuesday of my life, right up until the phone rang. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered it, expecting a foreman or a supplier.
Dad, Serena and I found the house, the one in Clearwater Pines. We need you to buy it for us.
His voice came through the phone like a verdict. I pulled the device away from my ear and stared at the glowing screen. As though the glass and metal might explain what I had just heard, I slowly pressed it back to my face. Say that again.
The house, Dad, $870,000. It's perfect. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, pool, the whole thing. Serena's already in love with it.
I listened to the brief pause on the line, feeling a strange tightening in my chest.
We can't afford the down payment right now, so we need you to cover it. The full amount.
I set down my coffee mug on the counter. I did it very slowly, the way a man sets down a glass he suspects might shatter into 1,000 pieces. Marcus, you are asking me to buy you a house.
For the family, Dad. For your grandchildren someday.
You don't have children.
We're planning to.
The toaster popped. Black smoke curled from the edges of the bread. I looked at the ruined toast, then at the phone in my hand. In that brief silence, 31 years flashed before my eyes. 31 years of building Hartwell contracting from a rusted 2-truck operation into a company worth respecting. I looked around my own home, a modest 4-bedroom colonial I had bought for $340,000 back in 2004, paid off with bleeding hands and 7-day work weeks. I thought about Marcus growing up under this very roof, watching me work, seemingly absorbing absolutely none of the lesson. No.
What?
The word landed like a heavy stone in still water, and I knew the ripples would change everything. No, I am not buying you a house. Not that house. Not any house.
Dad, wait. Are you serious?
I sat down at my kitchen table, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the early hour. Marcus, you make good money. Serena makes good money. You are 34 years old, yet you have been renting the same apartment for 3 years because you keep spending what should be your down payment on other things.
That's not fair,
I watched your wife rearrange your personality over the last 6 years the same way someone rearranges furniture in a new house. Decisively, and without asking. It's not that I dislike Serena, but her ambitions are relentlessly funded by my bank account. The European honeymoon I quietly subsidized, the car lease, the kitchen renovation, just because she cried about wanting to cook properly. I told myself each time was the last time. I am not going to solve a problem that keeps existing because neither of you wants to address it.
Dad, this is family. This is an investment.
It is an $870,000 investment in a property you picked out without even asking. You didn't ask, Marcus. You informed me, as though my money is a resource you are simply drawing from, like water from a tap. And frankly, even if I had that kind of cash to give you...
You sold the debt and contract last year. I know exactly what that was worth.
The air in my kitchen went completely still. I gripped the edge of the oak table. You have been watching my business finances?
People talk, Dad. Word gets around. You did well, really well, and we are family. What is the point of having all that money if you don't use it for family?
I closed my eyes and thought about my own father. A man who worked the line at a textile mill for 38 years and died with exactly $14,000 in his savings account. Yet he died with a dignity so complete it was almost architectural. I thought about what my father would say hearing this conversation. He would probably say nothing, because some things speak loudly enough on their own. The point, Marcus, is that it is mine. I earned it, and what I do with it is my decision, not yours.
Dad, please.
I love you, Marcus, but I am not buying the house. I ended the call. I looked down at my hands resting quietly on the table. They were not shaking. I was, in a very mild way, surprised by that. What happened next unfolded over the course of 3 long, instructive weeks. First came Marcus's silence. It lasted 4 complete days, and it was pointed, heavy, and total. It was the specific kind of silence that is weaponized, engineered deliberately to be felt, to create a vacuum that the other person is supposed to rush into and fill with apologies or concessions. I felt it. Of course I did. I noted the absence of his usual quick text messages about sports scores or minor work complaints, but I did not rush in to fill the void. Instead, I simply went about my business, letting the quiet sit between us like an uninvited guest. I filled those quiet days with the grounded reality of my routine. I met with my accountant to review the quarterly numbers for Hartwell, contracting, finding a strange solace in the cold, unfeeling logic of spreadsheets where numbers always added up and owed nobody an emotional explanation. On Tuesday, I had dinner with my old friend Pete Calloway. Pete had retired the year before and seemed happier, lighter than any man I had ever known. We drank cheap beer and talked about fishing, but looking across the table at Pete's unburdened face, I couldn't help but feel the heavy, invisible ledger of fatherhood weighing down my own shoulders. By Wednesday, I decided to tackle the fence along the backyard, a project I had been successfully postponing for 2 summers. There is a profound, almost spiritual comfort in manual labor when your mind is troubled. The rhythmic sound of the brush against the rough cedar, the sharp, chemical smell of the bright white paint, the immediate visible proof of progress. These things grounded me. I spent hours out there under the afternoon sun, scraping away the old peeling layers, thinking about how easily rot can hide under a surface that hasn't been properly maintained. I wasn't just fixing a fence. I was reinforcing my own boundaries. Then came Serena. She called on a Thursday evening, catching me just as I was washing the dried white paint from my knuckles. When I answered, her voice was a masterclass in calculated diplomacy, carefully arranged into something warm, reasonable, and seemingly completely devoid of malice. She said she wanted to talk. She suggested that perhaps there had been a simple misunderstanding between me and Marcus. She used words like alignment and clarity, speaking as though she were a project manager trying to smooth over a minor departmental dispute, rather than a daughter-in-law who had just been denied an $800,000 handout. She told me how much they valued my guidance, how she absolutely didn't want there to be any lingering tension in the family over something as silly as money. I listened politely through all of it. I listened the exact same way I used to listen to slick vendors pitching overpriced materials I had already firmly decided against buying. When she finally paused, expecting me to soften, I kept my voice perfectly level. "Serena," I said, "I think Marcus explained my position clearly. I am not going to change it. I hope you find a house you truly love. I genuinely do. And I will always be happy to sit down with you both to look at finances, make a viable plan, and figure out what is actually realistic for your current income. That offer always stands. But I will not be purchasing the property." The silence that followed was entirely different from Marcus's. It was shorter, sharper, and brittle, like the sound of ice cracking under pressure. "I see," she finally said, the artificial warmth evaporating instantly. "Well, Daniel, you should know this is going to be incredibly hard on Marcus." I didn't flinch. "A lot of things worth understanding are hard at first," I replied. She hung up before I did, which I supposed was fair. I set the phone down on the counter, knowing that the tactical retreat was only temporary. Serena was simply passing the baton to the next available asset in the family arsenal. The next move came on a Saturday from a completely expected yet formidable direction. My sister, Phyllis. Phyllis was 61, 3 years younger than me, and had spent the vast majority of our adult lives serving as the family's emotional switchboard. She was the one who relayed messages, smoothed over tensions, and delivered harsh verdicts cleverly disguised as gentle observations. She is not a bad person. In fact, she is a deeply loving one. But Phyllis possesses a unique, terrifying gift for wrapping other people's selfish agendas in the soft, unimpeachable language of maternal concern. She deployed this gift now with practiced, devastating fluency. She arrived utterly unannounced, bearing a warm cinnamon coffee cake and wearing an expression of carefully calibrated worry. "They're absolutely devastated, Danny," she sighed, settling herself at my kitchen table, the exact same oak table where the fateful phone call had happened, which felt poetically appropriate. "Serena has been crying for a solid week," she added, pushing the cake toward me. I picked up a knife and began slicing it. "Serena cries strategically," I noted calmly. The cake smelled incredible. Phyllis was, infuriatingly, an excellent baker. "That is a terrible thing to say about your daughter-in-law," she scolded gently. "Probably," I agreed, taking a bite. "But it is also perfectly accurate." I sat down across from her, resting my arms on the table. "Phyllis, I know exactly why you are here, and I appreciate that you care deeply about Marcus. But this is between me and my son. I have made a decision, and I am entirely comfortable with it." She leaned in, her eyes wide with that trademark pleading look. "But you have the money, Daniel. You've worked so hard, you have more than enough. What is the actual harm in just giving it to them?" "It would mean the absolute world to them." I looked at my sister for a long, quiet moment. Outside the kitchen window, a bright red cardinal landed on the top rail of the backyard fence, the freshly painted bright white section. The bird regarded us through the glass with an air of imperial indifference. I turned my attention back to Phyllis. "Do you remember what Dad said to me when I asked him to co-sign my very first business loan to buy my first 2 trucks?" I asked her. She blinked, caught off guard by the memory. "He looked me dead in the eye," I continued, "and he said, 'Daniel, if I do this and you fail, you will forever blame me for putting you in debt. And if I do this and you succeed, you will spend the rest of your life wondering how much of that success was actually yours.'" He refused to sign it, Phyllis. And he was absolutely right on both counts. I cut myself another small slice of the coffee cake, the sweetness suddenly heavy on my tongue. Marcus is 34 years old. He needs to build something of his own. He desperately needs to feel what that actual struggle, that real triumph feels like. If I just buy him a mansion, if I hand him the finish line without making him run the race, I take all of that away from him forever. I don't think that is kindness, Phyllis. I think that is something deeply destructive. Just walking around wearing kindness as clothes. My sister sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute weight of my words. The emotional switchboard had temporarily short-circuited. She looked at my worn hands, then up at my face, realizing the unbending finality in my posture. "You have really thought about this," she said finally, her voice stripped of its previous theatrical worry. "I have thought about very little else for 3 weeks," I answered honestly. We finished our coffee in a companionable silence. She left 2 hours later without raising the subject of the house again. Crucially, she also left the rest of the coffee cake on the counter. A silent gesture that I considered the ultimate mark of respect. The call that I had truly been waiting for. The real one, the one buried deep beneath all the layers of strategic silence, polite manipulation, and proxy negotiations, finally arrived on a crisp Wednesday morning, exactly 5 weeks after the mansion conversation. I was sitting alone in the cab of my work truck parked on the muddy shoulder of a sprawling commercial job site over on Mercer Road. The heater was humming faintly against the November chill, and I was holding a lukewarm thermos of coffee, watching my crew lay down the foundation for a new warehouse. There is a very specific, profound satisfaction in watching men build something physical from the ground up. You dig the dirt, you pour the concrete, you let it cure, and it holds weight. Human beings, however, are rarely constructed with such straightforward, predictable geometry. I watched the steel rebar being set into place, wondering if the structural integrity of my relationship with my son had survived the earthquake I had initiated. When my phone buzzed on the dashboard, vibrating aggressively against a stack of blueprints, I glanced at the screen and saw Marcus's name. My heart did a sudden heavy thud against my ribs, but I let it ring twice before picking it up. I pressed the phone to my ear, bracing myself for another wave of resentment, or perhaps another calculated pitch designed by his wife. But the voice that came through the speaker was entirely different this time. "Dad," he said, and the word hung there, stripped clean of the polished, practiced confidence that had served as his armor for the better part of a decade. He sounded smaller, uncertain, and deeply tired. "Can I come by tonight?" he asked, his tone lacking any of the entitlement that had defined our interaction 5 weeks earlier. I didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "The doors are always open," I replied simply. I hung up the phone and watched the cement mixers turning on the site, feeling the first faint tremor of genuine hope. Marcus arrived at exactly 7 o'clock that evening. I stood by the kitchen window, watching his headlights sweep across the driveway before the engine cut out. When he stepped out of his car, I noticed instantly that he was alone. It was the absolute first time, in 2 years, he had shown up to my house without Serena trailing beside him, adjusting the atmosphere to suit her preferences. He walked up the front steps slowly, his shoulders slumped under a heavy winter coat. When I opened the door to let him in, I saw that he looked exhausted. But not the kind of exhaustion that comes from putting in a 60-hour work week. He looked like a man who had been engaged in the agonizing, grueling labor of deep self-reflection. Hard thinking leaves its own particular, undeniable mark on a person's face, etching away the arrogance and leaving only raw, exposed truth behind. I guided him into the kitchen, the battleground of our previous encounters, and put a fresh pot of coffee on to brew. For a long time, neither of us said a single word. We just sat opposite each other at the heavy oak table while the machine hissed and sputtered in the background. In the past, silence between us had usually been tense, filled with unspoken judgments and defensive postures. But this silence was different. It felt porous, necessary, a clearing of the smoke before the actual damage could be assessed. It was its own kind of conversation, a mutual acknowledgement that the games had finally run their course. I pushed a steaming mug across the table toward him. He wrapped both of his hands around the warm ceramic, staring down into the dark liquid, as if gathering the courage to dive into it. "I went to the bank yesterday," Marcus said finally, his voice barely rising above the hum of the refrigerator. "I sat down and actually talked to Dave Kowalski about our finances, our actual finances, what we truly have versus what we constantly spend." He let out a long, shaky breath, rubbing his thumb along the rim of the mug. "It wasn't a comfortable conversation, Dad." I took a sip of my own coffee, keeping my gaze steady. "No," I agreed softly. "Those conversations usually aren't. Reality rarely cares about making us comfortable." He nodded, accepting the weight of the statement without flinching. "We've been spending," he started, then stopped, searching for the precise words. "We have been spending like we make significantly more than we actually make. It hasn't been one massive wild purchase. It's been consistent everyday blindness. Dinners, trips, upgrades. It's a slow leak, but it adds up to a flood." He finally looked up from his mug, meeting my eyes with a vulnerability that tore at my chest. "I knew it, Dad. On some level, I always knew we were bleeding money, but I absolutely refused to look at it directly. If I didn't look at the spreadsheet, it wasn't real. And the house in Clearwater Pines was going to magically fix all of that." I frowned slightly, genuinely confused by the twisted logic of it. "How does spending nearly $1 million fix a financial leak?" I asked. Marcus let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Because it would make us official. It would be a massive monument to our success. I thought that if we lived in a house like that, I would finally feel like I had made it, even though I knew deep down that I hadn't built the foundation to support it. I was trying to buy the finish line without running the race." The kitchen grew quiet again. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once into the cold night and then fell silent. Marcus shifted in his chair, leaning closer across the oak surface. "When you said no to me 5 weeks ago," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, "my first reaction was pure, blinding fury. I was absolutely furious with you. I thought you were being incredibly cruel. I thought you were hoarding your wealth, that you didn't trust me, or worse, that you didn't love me and were punishing me for not being the kind of son you wanted." He shook his head slowly, staring down at his hands. "Serena thought all of those things too, and she said them much louder than I did. But over the last few weeks, as the anger burned out, I started looking at the ashes left behind, and I finally realized something." He looked straight into my eyes, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't see the defensive teenager or the arrogant young professional. I saw a man finally stepping into his own skin, taking ownership of his failures. "I realized," Marcus said quietly, "that you were the only person in my entire life being completely honest with me. You were the only one looking at what I actually needed, instead of just blindly handing me what I was asking for. You knew I was drowning in my own entitlement, and instead of throwing me a gold-plated anchor, you forced me to learn how to swim. I needed someone to tell me the absolute, unforgiving truth." As he spoke those words, I felt a physical sensation in the center of my chest. It felt exactly like a tight, agonizingly complicated knot that had been twisting and tightening inside me for weeks was suddenly, miraculously working itself free. The tension I had carried, the terrifying fear that I had irreparably broken my family by holding the line, dissolved into the quiet warmth of the kitchen. I reached across the table and placed my calloused hand over his. "I have been telling you the truth your entire life, Marcus," I said gently, feeling the sting of unshed tears prickling the corners of my eyes. "Sometimes it just takes a little while for the signal to finally get through the static." For the first time all evening, the heavy exhaustion lifted from Marcus's face, replaced by a faint, genuine, and incredibly self-aware smile. "Yeah," he whispered, squeezing my hand in return. "Well, I haven't exactly been great at receiving it. What happened in the months that followed our conversation in the kitchen would not make for a particularly dramatic or compelling film. There were no explosive, tearful reconciliations in the rain, no grand group embraces, and absolutely no cinematic moment where Serena appeared at my front door fundamentally transformed overnight. Human reality, I have learned, rarely works with such sudden, satisfying theatricality. What actually happened was far quieter, significantly slower, and infinitely more durable. The transformation was not an event, it was a grueling daily process. Marcus and Serena finally sat down with a legitimate financial advisor, a real, uncompromising professional, not just the vague, constantly postponed future intention of one. and they built an actual, concrete plan. The implementation of that plan required a total dismantling of their previous lifestyle. They packed up their belongings and moved out of their trendy, overpriced rental, finding a much smaller, older apartment that cost substantially less. It was decidedly not the glamorous direction they had vividly imagined their lives moving in, but perhaps for that exact reason, the cramped quarters and outdated appliances proved oddly, brilliantly clarifying. The physical restriction of their space forced a psychological expansion of their maturity. They started saving money with a fierce, protective deliberateness that had been completely absent from their marriage before. Marcus quietly picked up a demanding side consulting project, spending his evenings buried in spreadsheets instead of browsing luxury real estate listings. And Serena, whose immense personal pride was considerable, but whose underlying pragmatism turned out to be equally formidable, swallowed her ego. She took on freelance marketing work that she had previously vocally considered entirely beneath her professional pedigree. They were struggling, but for the first time, they were struggling forward. 6 months after the infamous mansion phone call, Marcus came by my house on a quiet, overcast Sunday afternoon. He was wearing faded jeans and an old sweatshirt, carrying a heavy metal toolbox he had recently bought from a hardware store. For months, my heavy wooden garage door had been sticking stubbornly on its metal track, an annoyance I had been ignoring since the bitter cold of February.
Hey, Dad, I noticed the garage door was fighting you when I pulled into the driveway. I brought my socket set and some heavy-duty lithium grease. Let's get that track realigned.
I looked at the toolbox, then at my son. We didn't discuss the past, nor did we analyze the metaphor of fixing something broken. We simply went to work. We stood side by side in the dusty, oil-stained garage for 2 solid hours, speaking very little. We communicated through the passing of wrenches, the shared grunt of physical exertion, as we forced the heavy steel track back into its proper alignment and the quiet camaraderie of shared labor. When we finally finished, Marcus wiped a thick smear of black grease from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He reached down, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the door, and hoisted it upward. It glided upward along the freshly oiled track, swinging clean, smooth, and perfectly even.
There is something incredibly satisfying about that. Just seeing a physical problem, putting your hands on it and making it right. It feels real.
Yes, there is. It is the best kind of real there is. We went inside and had dinner together afterward, just the 2 of us. I served bowls of reheated, spicy beef chili and thick slices of dense cornbread that I had baked in a cast-iron skillet the day before. The kitchen was warm, smelling of cumin and baked corn. We sat at the same oak table where our war had started, but the atmosphere was completely unrecognizable.
Tell me more about Grandpa's textile mill, Dad. You mentioned he worked the line for almost 40 years. I realized I don't actually know much about what his day-to-day life looked like. How did he handle the absolute monotony of it without losing his mind?
And so, we talked. We talked for 3 unbroken hours. I told him stories about his grandfather's calloused hands, about the deafening roar of the mill's looms, and about the quiet, stoic pride the old man took in providing for his family on a meager wage. We talked about my own contracting business, the terrifying early days when bankruptcy was a constant shadow, and about what it genuinely felt like to build something lasting with your bare hands versus simply building a facade with your unearned ambitions. It was, without a single doubt, the best, deepest, and most honest conversation I could remember having with my son in 15 years, maybe longer. As I sat across from him, watching him listen intently, I did not harbor any illusions that I had been a perfect father. I knew my flaws intimately. I had been physically absent during the grueling years when my business was at its hungriest, and I had been physically present but emotionally distracted in the years immediately after. I was undeniably a better father when Marcus was a grown adult than I had been, when he was a vulnerable child, desperately learning how to become one. The emotional ledger between us was incredibly complicated, tangled with regrets and resentments, as all parent-child ledgers inevitably are. But I truly believed, sitting across from the man my son was finally becoming that Sunday evening, that I had gotten this one specific thing right. I hadn't said no because I was hard, or selfish, or indifferent to his comfort. I had said no because I loved Marcus enough to refuse him. It was an act of profound faith, a blind wager placed entirely on the integrity of the man I believed my son could eventually become. The sprawling mansion in Clearwater Pines sold to a wealthy orthopedic surgeon in exactly 11 days. I saw the property listed in a glossy real estate circular And then I saw the bright red sold sticker plastered across the manicured photograph a week and a half later. I felt absolutely nothing in particular about this development, except a wave of mild, settling relief. The distinct sensation of a heavy door firmly closing that had been left ajar for far too long. Time moved forward, bringing the freezing winds of December. A week before Christmas, I went to my heavy mahogany desk, opened my leather checkbook, and carefully wrote out a check to Marcus. It was not a check for an entire house. It was a check for exactly $10,000, explicitly earmarked as a humble contribution to their newly established down payment fund, a fund to be used only when Marcus and Serena had diligently saved enough to make up the rest of the purchase price entirely on their own terms. I gave it to my son in person, over the exact same kitchen table where the crisis had first ignited. I made no grand ceremonial speech about it. I simply slid the crisp slip of paper across the polished oak surface. "For the fund," I said quietly. "For whenever you are truly ready."
Dad, you didn't have to do this. We are managing. We're actually doing okay on our own now.
"I know you are. That is exactly why I wanted to do it. The morning I flatly refused to buy my son a mansion, I was burning my toast and arguing uselessly with a defective coffee maker. It was, by all measurable accounts, the most remarkably ordinary Tuesday of my entire life. But the truly extraordinary thing about ordinary Tuesdays is what they can miraculously become if you are finally willing to stand your ground and say the incredibly hard thing. You have to hold the difficult, unpopular line and trust that true love sometimes looks absolutely nothing like what the person you love is desperately asking for. Sometimes love looks like a harshly closed door in the face of entitlement. Sometimes it looks like a modest check written an entire year later, handed over only when the bitter lesson has had enough time to ferment into actual wisdom. And sometimes, on a quiet, overcast Sunday afternoon, over bowls of reheated chili, with a freshly greased garage door swinging clean and true on its metal track, it looks exactly like what it always was. A father and a son looking across a wooden table, finally speaking the exact same language.